Hi, everyone. This is Jason Barrack of Wall Street from Main Street, and independent financial journalist and managing editor of the News Doctors, Eric Dubin. Welcome back to another Welcome to Dystopia podcast. This is episode number 13. Today's special guest is a senior fellow at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. He also worked for Ron Paul from 2003 through 2013 as a legislative aide. Previously, he was a member of the Wisconsin State Board of Elections, co-manager of Ed Thompson's 2002 Wisconsin governor campaign, and a lawyer in New York and Connecticut. Adam Dick, thank you for joining us.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Now, Adam, you put out a very prescient piece recently about the gun debate. We've had a number of shootings in San Bernardino and a number of other places. And your piece, which I encourage our listeners to go to the Ron Paul Institute website, it's called No Gun for You, Obama's Soup Nazi Gun Control Proposal. I just finished reading it. I thought it was a good comparison to, you made some interesting comparisons there about the no-fly list and also about the Soup Nazi from Seinfeld.
Absolutely. It's what Obama's proposing is and he said it today that the San Bernardino killings happened, is that if you can't fly on an airplane under the no-fly list, then you shouldn't be able to buy or own a gun either. But the problem is that the no-fly list is operated with absolutely no respect for people's due process or other rights. What you have is some bureaucrat, unnamed, in some office, and we don't even know how many of these bureaucrats have the authority, who can put you on or off that list, either the no-fly list or the lesser selectee list that subjects you to greater harassment at the airport, but you still may be able to fly. And if you want to find out you've been put on the no-fly list, they just tell you can't fly, just like the soup Nazi in the Seinfeld says, no soup for you. You don't even know why. You have to sue in court, hire lawyers, spend years of a difficult and expensive process to hopefully find out you've been on the no-fly list and maybe get them to take you off of it. And that's what he's proposing for guns as well, that the same sort of arbitrary process be used to deprive people of the ability to exercise their right to bear arms that's explicitly protected in the Second Amendment.
Welcome to Dystopia. I mean, if you're a salesperson or you're a small business owner and you can't fly, and I know now there's video conferencing and things like that, but if you can't go person to person, face to face and make a handshake deal or something like that, your business is going to be in a major trouble. I'm sure there's going to be lots of unintended consequences for going forward for both that and also if they attempt to push this through Congress or an executive order with gun control.
Absolutely.
And the problem with this kind of a list is that it is arbitrary and that there are tens of thousands of people who get on it that are not really suspects for terrorism. So and there's no due process and there's no real way of getting oneself off of the list without very expensive court proceedings that will not necessarily work. So, the unfortunate thing about the debate about Second Amendment issues is that it always comes down to emotional arguments, and people line up on both sides of the aisle when it comes to this debate, but the realities are such that, more often than not, the discussion is not focusing on facts, and I find that pretty unfortunate.
Yeah, and this is, depriving people with flying. The Supreme Court and other federal courts haven't necessarily given it the same protection that gun rights have been given under the Heller decision. But at the same time, it has long been recognized that the right to travel is a fundamental right. The courts are making a distinction that you may be able to travel some other way than flying, which seems to me to not be the proper decision. The courts have given greater latitude here. But
right. What
the government has done is they basically said, this is good enough for government work. We'll just throw people on the list without a clear and constitutional due process respecting method of doing so. And it doesn't matter if we make mistakes. And they've realized and admitted that they have made huge mistakes in this. In 2007, an internal investigation by the U.S. government found that at that time there were tens of thousands of people who are on the no-fly list who shouldn't be there. So they know that the list is erroneous in huge proportions, but they continue to use it for that purpose. And now they figure, once we have the list, why not use it for guns too? And what will, and if they use it for guns, what will they use it for next? Once they start creeping, the creeping may never stop.
Yeah, Adam, there's millions of responsible gun owners out there that, just they have their handgun or rifle and they go to the shooting range and, they don't kill animals. They just go and target practice. It's for defense purposes, or they just enjoy shooting the gun at the shooting range. And it seems to me it's unfair that these people are going to be heavily penalized for the bad people out there who got guns either legally or illegally or whatever way, and, decided to go on shooting spree. So it's just very frustrating that, in society here, there's lots of people that do abide by the laws and, don't go on killing spree. There's lots of, adult gun owners who are responsible, and that they're going to look like they're going to be the ones penalized going forward.
Yeah, and, what we basically have here is a situation where they're trying to convict people of a pre-crime, saying that you look like you have a propensity to commit a mass murder, you and tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of other people. So we'll stop you from flying, we'll stop you from having a gun. And it's not just on the basis of terrorism even, it's also on the basis of people's mental health histories. And in New York State, they've put tens of thousands of people on a list saying that they're deprived of the ability to own guns because they're on a no-guns list there because a mental health worker wrote up an evaluation of their mental health that ended up in the hands of a county bureaucrat who, never sees the individual himself and just rubber stamps it, sends it on to the state government that throws them onto a list. And there, if you're on that list and they see that you've bought a gun and you might have one in your home, you'll have the police show up to take the guns away. And, just to compound things, even individuals who weren't the one that was put on the list but share the same name have had police show up at their house and take the guns away, and then it's your responsibility to go and prove you're not that person and get them back.
And to add to your point there, I think the newspapers in Westchester County up in New York, they also, like the reporters there who were, hardcore Democrat, they're rich hardcore Democrat, limousine liberal types, I guess, since Westchester County is one of the better, more well-off counties in New York. They actually published a list of all the people in the county that own guns. So my friend Kerry Lutz, who's another podcast host for Financial Survival Network, when he lived in New York in Westchester County, he was a successful lawyer and small businessman and entrepreneur, and he owned a handgun, for personal safety in his house. I guess he went to a shooting range, and he got a lot of flack for it because his name was in the paper. Whenever he went out to like local shops and things like in restaurants, people like, oh, Kerry, you own a gun, you're dangerous and all this. So it's like they're trying to create like this social outcast. I guess it's from brainwashing, Adam, it seems to me, like in the mainstream media and in government schools. We have, these gun-free school zone pledges, or, this school is drug-free. But, look in reality what happens when, look where all the shootings are in the gun-free zones or their government buildings that are supposedly gun-free. And there's a lot of drugs at schools, too. So, I mean, the government these bureaucrats trying to put up these signs saying, you can't do this. And people just people aren't going to listen to a stupid little sign.
Sure. I mean, Judge Andrew Napolitano, who's on the advisory board for the Ron Paul Institute, has had some great interviews over at the Fox News station where he works, talking about how gun-free zones are the most dangerous place to be, and he calls them no-gun zones, and that's absolutely correct. It's something that Dr. Paul, when he was in the House of Representatives, introduced legislation to get rid of those gun-free zones. And that would be a great advance for people's ability to protect themselves, and at the same time, for people who do a mass shooting, maybe they think twice if they thought that somebody there might be armed.
It is interesting to see that in response to events like what we saw in San Bernardino. Some communities are talking about making it mandatory that you have a school officer who's armed, or concealed carry teachers, or what have you. The debate on gun issues is so bifurcated, it's astounding. But the reality is that the statistics do not support the gun grabbers' positions. The reality is that when there are more average folk armed, be they concealed carry or just officers in general, the crime is lower. I mean, what's the city that has the highest rate of homicide killings by guns? It's one of the cities with the most restrictive gun control laws around, and that's Chicago. So
right. Another ones that in the past have, like D.C. and New York, have also had high gun restrictions. There is good news on the state level, though, that a fair number of states are respecting the right of people to carry more than they have in the past. Texas has extended to people who have concealed carry licenses the ability to carry openly as well, and carry has been extended onto the government universities here in Texas. Over in Kansas, though, just recently, they did it even better and allowed people to exercise constitutional carry, where they don't have to have a license and the approval of the government to be put on a list of people who are authorized to carry, and you can just carry a gun if you choose to. And that's something that's been in practice for a long time, and in the state of Vermont with no trouble whatsoever. It works fine.
Although I don't know if you saw the news out today, but the Supreme Court decided to not hear a case about Chicago's Highland Park, where they wanted to ban possession of magazines greater than 10 rounds. So by not hearing the case, they're basically saying local jurisdictions go ahead and regulate as you please, and go ahead and infringe on the Second Amendment as you please. So it's not a universal case that we're moving in the right direction.
Oh, no, in the Supreme Court, in the Heller decision that I mentioned before, that recognized that some gun control goes too far. It listed off all kinds of gun control provisions that it finds acceptable, and left open the possibility that many more sorts of restrictions would be acceptable too. While, an outright ban on guns, it would be inconsistent with Heller, and likely, if the Obama administration wanted to unilaterally implement some sorts of gun control, such as closing the so-called gun show loophole, there'd be separation of powers arguments that would be strong to counter that in a court case. But there's plenty of leeway, especially if the Congress goes along with Obama on something to implement gun control on a national level.
Yeah, I actually have some firsthand experience with this. Well, kind of. I graduated Virginia Tech a year before the shootings occurred, and I actually went to a lot of my classes were in one of the major buildings where a lot of the killings were. And, from knowing about Virginia Tech, like going a lot of off-campus parties and hang out with friends, off-campus in apartments, there was a lot of people who own guns off-campus, and they like to hunt and fish and go to the shooting range and things like that, because there's mountains and there's a lot of outdoor activities there at Virginia Tech, because it's up there in the Appalachian Mountains. And the campus guns were banned, and only the campus police had guns, but they were so late responding to the shootings that they could have saved a lot more people, and they didn't. So and Virginia Tech actually has a large amount of trained students that are in the Corps of Cadets, which are these guys it's a really advanced ROTC program, and these guys are well trained with guns, but they're not allowed to bring their guns on campus. And there was a lot of those students, in that building. They could have taken the shooter down at either place very quickly. So it's very unfortunate. There's a lot of it. Now, I know there's obviously like shootings in movie theaters and things like that, but most of the shootings, the shooters these crazy people or terrorists are looking to go kill people where they don't have guns, like you said earlier.
And it's a very serious matter if you do carry a gun somewhere where you're not allowed to carry it, or if you're charged with any crime while you're carrying a gun. There are these add-on penalties that the prosecutors will throw at you. And whenever you're accused of a crime, they add on as many charges as possible to try to force you into a plea bargain, so that no matter how innocent you are, you end up going to prison to avoid the risk of years and years in prison. One of the disturbing things happening right now in the U.S. Congress is there's a major sentencing reform legislation that does some good things in regards to mandatory minimums and some other workings of the court system, but at the same time, it increases the maximum allowable penalties for some of these gun charges. So it's a real barrier to people exercising their right to bear arms, because if you do so, you are taking this risk of being subject to this add-on penalties if ever you get in, you find you get yourself into a conflict with the police, and that's something to be very concerned about.
Now, I want to talk about the shooting statistics here in the United States, because the Democrats, the progressives, they always throw these shooting statistics that none of these shootings occur anywhere else. Is that really true? Because I know in England they banned guns heavily, but what the criminals have done, and I've gotten in arguments with some of our listeners about this in the comment section on past podcasts, but there's a lot of articles out there about this, is when the guns were banned, the criminals just all bought knives, and there's still killings and stabbings. The stabbings increased massively because the criminals just figured out, the loophole to the law that, I can't use a gun because I'll get more prison time, so I'll just use knives instead to rob people and hurt them and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's rather a false comparison that people are making between the United States and Europe. I mean, one thing is they don't correct for population. The United States has a very large population, so you compare it to some European country with a small population. You need to correct for that to determine which ones have the most mass shootings and the most people killed in mass shootings. But I know John Watt has an article over at Fox News that just came out on Thursday, where he says compared to European countries, if you correct for that population difference, the United States would be eighth in the number of mass shootings, and it would be about the same number in the number of people per million who've been killed in mass shootings over the last few years. So the numbers actually are more comparable than people believe. I mean, it was rather silly. President Obama was over there in prison saying, in Paris, saying this sort of thing happens in the United States, but not in other places. And they've just been a huge mass shooting in Paris with about 130 people killed. So I think a lot of times we're just relying on people here not to know what happens in other countries so that they can make a false comparison.
You also have cases of Switzerland where, culturally people have a very high level of respect and understanding of what guns are for, and everyone is armed there, and they have an unbelievably low rate of, gun violence. So all of these debates and comparisons do need to be put in the proper context.
Yeah, and I'm very worried when these Democratic politicians, these progressives, say how good Europe is, because they talk about, they want, universal health care, they want the European gun laws. Well, things aren't so bright and rosy in Europe. They talk how good the Scandinavian social democracies are. Bernie Sanders says, I'm not a Soviet communist, I want a European social democracy. But you come out and you see these articles on Zero Hedge and so many other places, there's a lot of people in these Scandinavian countries that are not very happy. They have large welfare states. They don't have as much warfare, but people are unhappy, and there's, I think there is occasionally shootings. There's shootings in Norway. I know the statistics are showing that too and things like that. So it just worries me that the politicians, they're always trying to move things, whether it's gun ownership or the economy or healthcare, things like that, towards, European social democracies.
Right. Now, probably the one area, though, regarding shootings where Europe is doing much better generally than the United States is in shootings by police. The United States has an incredible high number of people killed by police, and the numbers tend to be much better in Europe on that.
How frequently do you see law enforcement communities making the argument that all gun control efforts are in fact counterproductive? I mean, I see that every once in a while in Texas and other places where there's a high level of understanding. But I'm curious if in your wanderings on this issue, because you do spend so much time on this issue, if you have seen any kind of advocacy coming from the law enforcement community pushing back against brainless gun-grabbing efforts.
Yeah, I think there's differences of opinion among the police on that, and you do have police chiefs that are supportive of the right to bear arms. I think you'd find it similar on with a lot of police on the drug war. You know, there are a fair number that, from their own personal experience, they realize that that's ridiculous to be throwing people in prison for marijuana, for example. And on guns, you'd find a fair number of police that would think the same way. But if you're unlucky enough to encounter a cop who thinks the other way, or live in an area where the top cop, you know, is very anti-gun, you can have some significant problems.
Now, Obama, in his speech we have the New York Times article, this main one that came out last week, and obviously they were calling for far stricter gun control laws, and we had Obama give his speech last night. What types of legislation or executive orders can they come in and, you know, heavily tax gun ownership further? You know, maybe like a 5% or 10% tax per year or something like that, or drastically raise the cost of maintaining a license. What type of tools do you think they're gonna attempt to restrict gun control? Because normally the one way that these Democrats like to restrict things is with, you know, taxes and make you paying more fees and things like that.
Well, taxes should have to arise from the Congress. The executive branch shouldn't be able to impose any new taxes, and we would hope that the courts would enforce that. But there might be regulatory room to do certain things. One of the things that President Obama has talked about is closing the so-called gun show loophole, which is just the ability to buy a gun without having to go through the background check if you buy it from an individual whose, you know, primary business isn't selling the gun, or if it's given to you by your uncle or something like that. You know, they call that a loophole, the ability to exercise your freedom not to have your name thrown into a database and be forced to answer a bunch of questions from the government about your life. But closing the gun show loophole probably is beyond what Obama can do without congressional authorization. And constitutional lawyer and Professor Jonathan Turley wrote a good article about this a few days ago, where he explained that the reason Obama couldn't do that on his own is that Congress has had plenty of opportunities in consideration of large gun control bills and debates each year to close that so-called loophole, and has consistently decided not to do so. And that in deciding not to do so in all these repeated considerations, Congress has decided the matter. You know, it's not an oversight, it's not an accident, it's not an ambiguity. Congress has explicitly decided that they do not want the government imposing background checks on those sales.
But that's probably going to change, just the political climate. Even in Oregon, we in the last year had the ability to sell person-to-person restricted by a new law, and now that is illegal in Oregon. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that on a national level change. There was a couple of years.
Sure, it certainly could. And you can't trust on the fact that Republicans are in control in the House or Senate to stop it either. Remember, when George W. Bush became president, he was fine with keeping the assault rifle ban. So there's plenty of history of Republicans doing the wrong thing on this, and even the National Rifle Association, you can't trust to be friendly to gun rights and all these things. Down in Florida, they were pushing legislation that was signed by the governor down there that expanded the information put into the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, the NICS database, and it put into the list of people who are prohibited from owning guns down there individuals who had been voluntarily committed for mental problems, in addition to people who were involuntarily committed. So, the NRA is to some extent in favor of expanding the prohibitions on gun ownership.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Now I do know because I do have a political science degree, and I did briefly do some internships around I live right outside of Washington D.C., so I did some internships in Washington D.C. And the stuff I would hear about the NRA was how powerful of a lobbying group they were and special interest group, and that they would fight for the rights of gun owners and things like that. So you're saying they're starting to make compromises now in order to, I guess, play ball with the establishment. But I thought basically in the past they had basically just fought every single thing restricting gun ownership.
Well, I'm not sure that that's true going all the way back. I'm not sure how strong of an opponent, in example, in '68 with the Gun Control Act, the NRA was, but you can't rely on them, with blind faith. They definitely exposed with their desire to expand exclusions for gun ownership for people with mental health issues, that they aren't 100% behind the protection of the right to bear arms. You have to.
Yeah.
You have to consider that these individuals, just like the ones on the no-fly list, did not go through any court proceeding to determine that they were a real risk to anybody else. They didn't have counsel to defend them. They didn't have the ability to call witnesses. They had none of that. They've just been put on a list and said to be dangerous. And it's disturbing too, because the medical associations are opposed to the expansion of these lists, and on the opposite side of the NRA. And a large reason that they are is that they legitimately argue that, first of all, these people, just because they have some mental issues, are not prone to mass murder. That's not true, but for most of them. But at the same time, they also argue that if you put people on a list automatically because they seek mental help, then less people will seek mental help. If you're an individual who likes to go hunting regularly, or want to use a gun, have a gun in your house to defend yourself, and you know that going to a psychiatrist and seeking help could potentially put you on a list so that you can no longer do those things, well, you just might continue to suffer from a mental problem without seeking help.
Which in turn could increase the number of people who take out their anger or what have you with firearms. The one thing that is the bottom line that is always most frustrating to me about these whole debates is that, it'd be one thing if there was some evidence that gun violence and crime would be reduced if there were gun control efforts. And the fact of the matter is there's absolutely no evidence that shows that there's any kind of systemic reduction of crime being committed, because criminals and terrorists will get guns when they want it. I mean, that's the bottom line. And the only people that are hurt by gun control efforts are average law-abiding citizens who are not able to protect themselves from crime or to shut down a terrorist attack. And, the reality of the basic arguments are such that no one talks about it in these terms. It's always an emotional debate, and people line up on either the gun grabber side or gun rights, and no two shall mix. I mean, that's just where we are. So you think that in the long run, the more people will be aware of the realities of the statistics in this debate, Adam, going forward, or is it just going to be more of an emotional debate and never changing from that?
Well, I think one of the things to be optimistic about here is something I touched on a little when I was talking about some changes in gun laws in Texas and Kansas, is that state and local governments to a certain extent are going their own way on this. are being more protective of people's right to bear arms. So even if the national government wants to crack down on it, there will be opposition. And I don't know if it'll reach the point that it's reached on marijuana, where it seems like the rebellion of state and local governments has been so strong and so widespread that the U.S. government, at least in those states and localities that have legalized medical and recreational marijuana, the federal government has just backed down for the most part. And we'll see that happen with guns as well, if more states pick up steam in opposing the gun controls.
I hope you're right. I mean, when it comes to medical marijuana and recreational marijuana,
to ban the federal government enforcing its gun law, any new gun laws in their states as well. So you could have states that not only have very liberal in the old sense of respecting of liberty gun laws, but you also might have states where they'll tell the police to interpose themselves between an individual exercising gun rights and the federal government trying to enforce new gun control restrictions.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. People get heated about it. I mean, I've gone to the shooting range a number of times, and I enjoy, target practice there with a handgun and things like that. I haven't killed any animals hunting, but the people around Washington, D.C., especially a lot of these progressive women around there, oh, you went to the shooting range? What's wrong with you? Do you own a gun? Like, I just get looked at like there's something wrong with me, even though I enjoy doing something and I'm not harming anyone else just going to the shooting range. It's really sad, I guess, that the narrative that's been painted by the media is that, anyone who likes to just shoot, go to target practice is looked at pretty badly now. I guess maybe in another state, like down south or in the Midwest or in the West Coast, it might not be as bad, but, here in the Northeast, right outside of D.C., it's looked at pretty badly.
Well, yeah, and one of the things that people in the media and politicians are talking about with the individuals accused of the mass murder in San Bernardino is that they had this great stash of weapons that could only be intended to conduct a mass murder. But a couple rifles, a couple pistols, that's nothing. There are millions of people around the country that have that. And
yeah.
Yeah, so but what they want to put in people's mind is, if you have a neighbor who, like plenty of people do down here in Texas, who has a gun safe the size of a closet, and it's full, that guy's planning a mass murder. No, he's not. He just likes
a collector.
A bunch of different kinds of guns. That's it.
He could be a collector too. Yeah.
Right.
And these individuals only had a couple thousand rounds, and they were 9mm and .223. I mean, it's just very basic stuff, but the media is painting it as if they're armed and ready to take down the government.
Right. Yeah, the ammunition is not unusual either. You buy it in boxes that can contain a lot of bullets, and if you do go to the shooting range regularly, then it's nice to have a lot on hand.
Yeah, but around here, there's all the shooting ranges. You can't bring in your own ammunition. You have to buy from there. So I guess that's a way to pre-screen then for them to also make more money. Right.
That's a kind of a Baptist and bootlegger situation where the shooting range and the anti-gun people could conspire to have a law like that.
Well, Adam, I think I want to change topics now. Eric and I, we tend to talk about markets a lot, but this was an interesting thing to cover right now, especially with the Paris events and also with San Bernardino. And we want to give our listeners a perspective and a narrative that differs from what the mainstream media is saying. Because if you listen to the mainstream media, anyone who likes even going to the shooting range is probably a bad person. Eric, the RMB now, it was just recently announced by IMF. They're putting it into the special drawing rights, or SDR. It's not going in until, I guess, October of next year in 2016. What do you think this is going to mean going forward then?
Well, it's just reflecting the greater use of the renminbi in international trade. They're now the second most used currency for clearing of transactions of goods and services. So the IMF is just catching up with object reality. The renminbi only represents around 2% or so of the reserve assets that are held in central banks, sovereign wealth funds, etc. But that'll change over time, and a force of economic activity on a worldwide basis is shifting more and more to the east, and as China increases its economic power, the currency will be used more and more, and that'll be a better thing for geopolitics. We'll see the world move more in a direction of a multipolar world, as opposed to the dreams of our neocon establishment that would love to see the United States dominating the world order. So that's really the big picture, and it will be interesting to see how much friction there will be between the United States and China. There definitely was some division in the establishment of the United States when it came to whether or not the IMF was going to grant us, but ultimately the momentum is such that you can't ignore the progression and growth of Chinese economy.
Yeah, we talked about this on the last show, how the U.S. was actually successfully for the last couple of years blocking the RMB into the SDR. Now, going forward, though, we are going to see, some of these gold promoters are going to say this is a total game changer, overnight. We're going to start seeing people pumping gold and silver, saying, overnight, once in October of 2016, this is going to be a total, complete game changer, and gold and silver are going to be totally revalued. I'm sure, Eric, we're going to see either those articles in between now and October of 2016,
Maybe.
or we're going to see a lot of them around then. But I don't think that this is going to have an immediate effect overnight where it's going to drastically revalue gold and silver, unless, the gold and silver markets, the COMEX and the LBMA totally collapse. I think this is like a death by 1,000 cuts type of scenario where, the RMB does continue to gain more reserve power. It's a transactional currency. It's a pretty darn large transactional currency already, but it's not a large reserve currency yet. But that should increase, over the next decade or so. So it's impossible to tell. I think, I said it would take at least once RMB was officially included, we wouldn't see a lot of effect until at least 6 to 12 months, and you thought longer. It could take a couple years before we start to see anything material come out of it. But, it means the writing's on the wall. And the IMF, although the U.S. had the most votes, like we said on the last podcast, the U.S. can't block everything. The IMF sees the writing on the wall. They're starting to help China internationalize their bonds. A lot of European countries and South Korea are. So there's clearly signs that the world is starting to, the U.S.'s unipolar system is starting to fray.
Well, yeah, and it's an evolutionary process. I mean, it's not going to take years for the ultimate impact to manifest. It'll be in stages, and you can already see how, in fact, that's evolving. I mean, Russia's involvement in the Syrian war theater is a multifactorial response to all the stuff that's been going on in terms of the rising power of Russia and China in their primary alliance vis-a-vis what's going on with the, for lack of a better way of putting it, the Anglicist empire, the NATO-aligned countries, and how they face off against Russia in the Ukraine, for example. I mean, there's an element of the dollar's reserve status that even fits into those kind of geopolitical confrontations. So the movement away from a unipolar world order is well underway, and it's not going to stop, even though the United States would be willing to risk even going all the way to the threshold of nuclear war when it comes to confronting Russia in the theater of Syrian war theater, or what was going on earlier with the Ukraine when it was a lot hotter than what it is now.
Yeah, we've seen multiple attempts by the U.S. military through launching that missile over the California West Coast, putting it on social media, and also flying over the South China Sea. I think they've tried to bait China and Russia into potential military actions, maybe to start World War III, because I guess they know the real economy is in the toilet in the United States. It's not as good as they say, and as we heard from Keynes and other economists, they believe war is good for the economy, even though it's really not. Okay, well, my next news story, we have two more before we get to the Scumbag of the Week nominees, which are pretty hilarious this week. We have the impeachment proceedings for the president of Brazil. She's being accused of corruption, of misappropriating money, and giving sweetheart contracts and loans and things like that to her cronies. This happens after, I guess Warren Buffett says, when the tide rolls out, you see who's swimming naked. So, with the developing countries, they all loaded to China. They leveraged their economies to China. They gambled on the Chinese economy continuing to be good, higher commodities prices for oil and copper and base metals and iron ore and things like that. And, now that those commodities have collapsed, we've had busts. Now Brazil is just stuck with the debt. They can't pay off the debt. Their currency against the dollar has gone down a lot. They can't pay off the debt. Like I said, they may be a victim of hyperinflation. Brazil has had a lot of hyperinflations, I think 4 or 5, since the 1940s. So Brazil has a history of hyperinflations every number of decades. And, it seems to me like, the Olympics is coming up soon, next summer in Brazil. Things are going to get really dicey there because a lot of the money was spent on infrastructure that they needed higher commodity prices basically to pay off the debt, with higher GDP, and their GDP is contracting. So it looks like a mess there, Eric. And obviously we've seen the corruption and debt problems with Petrobras, which is one of their larger companies. So it's no surprise that that's also in the government. My final news story before Scumbag of the Week, it has to do with OPEC. They met they met last week, and they couldn't agree on any production cuts. And naturally, the oil prices are going to continue to slide. I was actually looking at some of the larger shale oil producers, reading articles and looking at some balance sheets over the weekend, like Whiting Petroleum and Continental Resources. And Whiting Petroleum claims to be cash flow positive at $50 oil, but we're not at $50 oil. And they're also saying that, we can buy time by, using our revolving credit facility, which means basically using their credit card to pay off other debt to buy time and hope for higher oil prices to survive. Mm-hmm. So I guess this is a situation most of the oil producers are in right now in the market, where they can't really sell shares because their shares are down. Maybe they're selling assets at fire sale prices. Maybe they're negotiating with larger companies to put their company up for sale, and they don't want to tell the market that yet. But we're at a situation here where the oil companies and entire governments producing oil cannot really afford lower oil prices for that much longer. Everyone thought there was basically no way that the oil prices would stay this low for a long time. Now we're in a situation where the oil companies took on debt at a higher price and they're in trouble. So we're having a big bust right now for over 12 months. It's probably going to be a little bit longer. But then, on the supply side of things, there's going to be huge problems with oil. And, the oil companies that do survive, they're going to go up a lot. So it's a stock picker's market. Maybe you buy an ETF or figure out. But, with the OPEC decision here not to cut oil prices, OPEC's claiming it's powerful, but it looks like it has no power at all if they can't cut prices in a market that basically, if they can't cut production in a market where production, there's at least somewhat of an oversupply, maybe up to 2 million barrels per day. So it's a dicey situation, man. The oil market, Eric, I don't know about you, but it's looking like the two main black swans right now going forward are the developing countries that are drastically over-leveraged. Those guys, almost all of them are in major trouble, and also a lot of the oil-producing economies and a lot of oil companies. Those look like to be the next group of black swans.
Well, I don't know if you can call them black swans because it's pretty well advertised that, you have debt issues. So, but the turmoil is, started appearing in the marketplace, and it's amazing that companies have been able to juggle as much as they have with their, hedges and ability to draw on credit lines as much and as long as they have been able to do. And we're only now beginning to see the debt, laden companies with their backs up against the wall beginning to drop like flies. So,
Yep.
It'll be an interesting first quarter in particular next year.
Yeah, I don't think this can continue on for that much longer. I had Jim Willey on, and he was talking about how the banks, instead of writing off the loans that they gave to these oil companies as, bankruptcy and default and things like that, they just changed the terms on the load covenant. They slip them a little bit more debt to buy them another 3 months or
Right.
6 months. They give him a little bit more money on the side, and they just they say, oh, he's not in violation of the loan covenant, even though the companies probably are. So I guess the rules are being changed so the banks don't have to fully write off the debt. But, unless the oil prices go back up, a lot of these companies are in trouble. They have slashed prices, but, they're still stuck with debt and things like that. So the bust is going to continue, and it might even get worse in the short term. But, it's going to cause supply problems down the road because over $150 billion in investment in the oil industry has already been cut just in the last 12 to 18 months. And that's a lot of future supply of oil that's not going to be brought online. My last, we're going to move on now to the Scumbag of the Week nominees. They're pretty funny this week. Eric, you wanted to nominate Mark Zuckerberg. Now, you had some problems with Facebook. You want to tell listeners about that and also about maybe Zuckerberg's attempt at doing some charity work?
And I don't think Adam heard the story about me getting censored, so he'll find this amusing as well. Facebook had taken down thousands of my posts and thousands of my comments about a day before Thanksgiving and put me on a 7-day hold. They didn't say why, and they never tell anybody why they censor people, but with the exception of my personal account and stuff that I could put on my so-called personal wall, and on accounts where my admin account is also shared with other admins on a corporate account, like, for example, the News Doctor's Facebook page. With the exception of those type of pages, everything that I was formerly able to do on Facebook was restricted. It was a pretty draconian across-the-board censorship of everything that I've done on Facebook over the 5+ years. I've been very active on it. So, I've talked about this in a number of podcasts, and I wrote an article about it, so I don't need to belabor the points here, but suffice it to say, I mean, if they can take down someone like myself and with thousands of posts, they can take anybody down. It's very depressing to see this kind of stuff going on, and largely it's a response to what happened in Paris. We Are Change had their website taken offline in Paris. Most of the posts relating to anything critical in terms of its analysis of what it went on in Paris in the We Are Change 16,000 plus member Facebook group were stricken. I know there were a number of other people that had their accounts on hold as well, and I'm still trying to investigate just how extensive that censorship was, but suffice it to say, this kind of stuff is going to happen more frequently in the United States as well. They're planning on using hate speech and just mob rule flagging systems in social media to restrict speech, and we're going to see a lot more of that on a going forward basis. But we had that funny story about Mark Zuckerberg talking about establishing a foundation where he would take 99% of his Facebook shares and stuff it into the foundation, and it would be a tax-free haven where he would have the full benefit of using all of that economic firepower to back companies and do for-profit enterprises and political objectives of his choosing, just in the keeping of how oligarchs and time past have done that before. They established foundations to be able to house their monies in a tax-free sanctuary. So, he got a little bit of flack, and it's deserving, and all the more ironic, and it brought a smile to my face to see that story, given what happened to me with Facebook. So.
Well, the funny thing, Eric, is that he's been putting out either misinformation or he's been trying to explain himself, with posts and things like that recently. And he claims that he put the shares in an LLC, limited liability company, and that he's going to pay capital gains on the shares when he sells them to invest in other things. But that could just be a front, because there's ways around that. What he could with the right tax lawyers and tax attorneys, he can figure out ways to reduce his tax burden and things like that. But he's claiming that he will pay taxes on it. So we'll see in actuality if that actually happens.
He made those claims when the heat was turned up. The reality of the reason why he was using that structure in the first place is to avoid taxes.
Okay, well, I have a couple more scumbag nominees. Obama recently, in the last couple months, I didn't catch this news story until recently, and a friend shared it with me on Facebook. He's been still giving speeches bragging about how he's restored the U.S. as the most respected country in the world.
Yeah, well.
Oh man, maybe only him and his like neocon on foreign policy and like his bureaucrats probably, him and only those people probably think that. What frustrates me is that we keep hearing like all these Democrats say how the U.S. is the richest country in the world and we should be able to afford healthcare and all these other things for people. They don't even have you ever heard any of those people, Eric, talk about our debt problems or anything like that at once?
No.
Yeah, I've tried to bring that up, like, showing them the website for the US debt clock and that's no big deal and all this other stuff. So, I mean, people are so brainwashed that, they look at our GDP, they listen to like the mainstream financial media and the New York Times and things like that, and the economy's recovering and we can afford all these new projects and things like that. They don't understand how bad the debt problem really is. Finally, my last Scumbag of the Week nominee, I guess it's for Congress. There's now a new bust in the Capitol building, and I guess all vice presidents do get a bust, but apparently Dick Cheney is being honored for ending terrorism. You got it. Did you see a picture of his bust, the statue he got? Eric, he's got a big like devilish smile on there. It's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, well, it's pretty Orwellian. What can you say?
Exactly. Yeah, they're claiming the invasion of Iraq is ending radical Islamic terrorism. Didn't it start even more radical Islamic terrorism with ISIS and yeah. And it brought more people into ISIS and Al-Qaeda and things like that. So it did the opposite of what they're claiming. It's just unbelievable, though. I mean, these guys it's like what Doug Casey says, how like, why are these politicians putting their names on everything when they, do harm to the economy and create wars and things like that. So I guess they just want to pat themselves on the back for telling everyone how awesome and important they are.
So Adam, you still there?
Yeah, and it's talking about Dick Cheney and the creation of ISIS related to U.S. foreign policy. I mean, that does bring you back to the recent shootings down in California. This looks like it could be another instance of blowback. If it's right that the people who did it were upset by U.S. foreign policy and supportive of ISIS, well, all of this goes back to, the decades of U.S. interference in foreign nations, stirring up trouble, drones hitting wedding parties and everything else, invasions of countries, occupation, supporting foreign dictators. If the U.S. wants to stop, future attacks, mass killings in the U.S., well, the best thing they can do is not implement more gun control. The best thing they can do is to stop the foreign intervention, bring the troops home, and stop supporting the dictators overseas, and stop supporting the people wanting to overthrow the dictators overseas too. Just get out of it.
Yeah. But that's
well said.
That's too rational, Adam. I mean, we can't have any of that.
Oh well, the military-industrial complex won't go for that. There's too much profit.
Right.
Instead, what they'll do, and I've heard some confirmations of this from friends who posted on Facebook, is, they're going to arm the police and the government agencies like the Homeland Security and FBI and those guys. They're going to get even more weapons and things like that and new tech to track people. They're going to track people even more on social media and other things like that. And I also heard, like I said, from a couple friends, because I grew up in California, who posted from California, and they're like police and law enforcement contacts in Southern California are saying that, now they're more actively searching for ISIS cells in Southern California, and they're just going like breaking down doors and things like that. And I don't know if the news is even covering this.
Yeah, I mean, they're bringing back the redcoats. That's what they're turning the police into. The police are becoming, no longer peace officers. They're becoming an occupying army.
I completely agree with you. It's a very good point. It's really sad, in the state that we're in right now. You see so much police brutality with many different groups and people who are disabled, and I guess a lot of the Black Lives Matter was started off of police brutality. It's just unfortunate, that these policemen continue to get more and more weapons. They should get more sensitivity training, and they should learn how to, handle situations without, killing people and things like that. But, it looks like there's going to be more collateral damage in the United States domestically and abroad too, unfortunately, going forward.
Yeah, and that is how police used to operate. Much more was the idea of de-escalation, that they were supposed to come in and help settle things to a peaceful resolution, and instead, you have situations like with Sandra Bland down here in Texas. She was stopped for changing lanes without using her turn signal, and as everything was winding down, where he was either going to give her a ticket or a warning, the police officer asked her, why are you frustrated or nervous or something like that, which is a fishing question. The reason the police ask that is because they're trying to draw information out of you so that they can do a search of your car usually. It's possible he was just asking out of curiosity, but that's one of the reasons they do that. And she told him, I'm irritated because, you stopped me, of course, and
telling the truth to a cop, not a good idea, right?
Yeah,
like that,
then,
telling that type of truth, being that blunt.
And then she compounded it by he told her to put out the cigarette she was smoking in her own car. She said no. He pulls her out of the car, roughs her up, arrests her. She ends up, dead in her jail cell 3 days later. The police say she committed suicide. But no matter what happened, that caused her ultimate death, none of it would have happened if the policeman had just de-escalated the situation. Even from the beginning, he followed her for quite a while close, like police do, just waiting for her to do something that would give him the pretext to pull her over. So, from beginning to end, it's just this attitude of the police having us against them, kind of the occupying army attitude, and it leads to death, and it leads to people being hurt, with tasers that are supposedly non-lethal, but if you get hit a bunch of times or you have some medical condition, they're lethal enough. And it's disturbing that our foreign policy, creating mass murders here and in Paris and elsewhere, with the French foreign policy too, it leads to further crackdowns, and we have this cycle. That Robert Higgs calls, crisis and Leviathan, where the government creates a crisis, and in response to the crisis, it ramps up authoritarianism and creates yet more crisis to ramp things up further in the future.
Yeah, it's a never-ending cycle. It's a vicious cycle. I've listened to former policemen talk about how to deal with cops the best way, and this woman, it sounds like, she was frustrated or was having a bad day or stressed out or whatever. Being brutally honest with policemen, like in that sense, that's not the right way to go. You be polite as possible. If they give you a ticket, they give you a ticket. At least, you're not in a jail cell. You're not tasered or anything like that. So I guess you be as polite as you can with the officer, and then you take your ticket and then you get on your way, and maybe you can fight the ticket later. But at least you're not injured or worse. Well, Adam, I just want to thank you again for your time. Eric and I really enjoyed this discussion. Unfortunately, I think there's going to be more shootings in the United States because there's a lot of people, on medication. On medication, I know there's a lot of people who are depressed. I actually did, Eric and I, on a previous episode, we also talked about this a little bit. I said there's a lot of adult males in my age demographic, who just graduated college, 18 years old, or just graduated college to low to mid-30s, who don't have a consistent job, don't have a girlfriend, they're depressed, they don't like their lives very much, they're trying to get ahead, and the economy is not doing well, they may be on medications. When you combine all these factors, with depression and things like that and medication, you've opened themselves up for potentially, being angry at society or the world and things like that. So I think a lot of this also goes back to, government control, and it also goes back to how the government is basically ruining the economy. Like I've said on another Welcome to Dystopia podcast, I think if the economy was much better and a lot of adult males, had good jobs, money in their pocket to spend, and had a girlfriend, they were actually getting laid more routinely, I don't think there would be as much, shootings and violence and stuff. Okay, well, thanks again for your time, Adam.
Thank you.